This is International Master Eric Kislik, and I've got a fun one today. How to Beat Magnus Carlsen. This is a spin-off on the Edmar Mendes book, How to Beat Bobby Fischer. And I'm going to be basically illustrating examples of Magnus Carlsen games, errors that he made, and basically what that means and how somebody might be able to take advantage of them or make use of them in some way. So first of all, I want to say that when you do a player profile, which is one of the most enjoyable things to do in chess, really kind of digging deep, going through, it can very often mean going through hundreds of games. A lot of the times you'll look through a Grandmaster's games and you might look through 30 games and not be able to notice any patterns. So fortunately, in the case of Magnus Carlsen, I've tried to follow all of his games for the last 8 or 10 years. There are some games that I missed, like from the World Rapid Championship or World Blitz Championship. So this time around, I tried to look through all those games. And essentially, there are a few steps for how you build a player profile. First of all, you see how they lost games. You get a general idea of what caused them to basically have their position fall apart. Did they lose material? Did they get mated? One thing which is really impressive about Carlsen's games is that there are very few games in which he was actually positionally outplayed. I had a very hard time finding almost any. But the mistakes that were made were very interesting ones, and I'm certainly not saying that Carlsen is a weak player, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's just very interesting that even the highest rated player in the world is making certain types of mistakes. Well, clearly if they're not playing at 3300 engine level, but it's really interesting to look at the types of mistakes that were made, because you'll notice that some of the mistakes here are actually ones that can be addressed. So continuing on, essentially you look at how they lost games, you see how they got outplayed, you see what kind of moves they miss. This is important because there are certain types of moves which are fundamentally difficult moves to find. And for instance, Xray type moves, retreating moves, sliding moves, certain piece sacrifices can be difficult to find and play. So those are all quite important. And essentially, if you notice that certain types of moves are being missed by a player, you can pay extra close attention and look out for them during games. And I know that sounds very generic, but let's say, for instance, two pieces are challenging each other. If somebody has a tendency to miss sliding moves, you may notice that you might have a strong sliding move that your opponent underestimated or didn't consider. So there are a lot of little things like that where if you notice somebody has a weakness in some area, you may actually be able to consciously make use of that information at the board. Of course, in the case of a player over 2800, those will be few and far between. You aren't going to find many of them, but in the case of Carlsen's games, I basically noticed a few different things. I noticed, to summarize the types of errors that I noticed there were certain types of simple mistakes, and I'll be illustrating all those. I'll basically tell you which game it was played in. If you want to take a closer look, I'll be going through these, so I'll be moving through them quickly. But there were certainly cases of missing moves. There were cases of overpressing, which was a common one, which is totally understandable for the highest rated player in the world. And there were definitely cases of underestimation of king position. And more recently, and this is actually something that Carlsen has said himself, he was a little bit lazy in pressing home some advantages. And one IM brought a couple games to my attention, so I'll be mentioning those. The first game that I'll be starting with is Carlsen Gawain Jones, played in Tata Steel in 2018, earlier this year. And what's kind of shocking about this game is that Carlsen played the move G4, which was a blunder, and after the move F4, the knight on G5 was just hanging. So it's a little hard to understand how this move was played. And I mean, there was a lot of talk about this move, and I don't think we got any clear answers, but blunders are made, and sometimes blunders are made, and then you notice it doesn't influence the player in any way. So that can easily happen. And he played H4 and just played on. He just kept playing on without the piece, and this was definitely a lost position. So First thing I'm going to talk about are trapped pieces, either trapped pieces or won pieces in some of his games. And some of these are from Rapid or Blitz, but if somebody's playing him in Rapid, that's quite relevant to be aware of how he loses Rapid games. So fortunately, the games of his that I'd studied that were Rapid games are relevant to this as well. All right, let's go on to the next one. The next one was a pretty surprising one. It was Voltashek Carlson, played and taught to steal 2015. So Carlson was world champion at the time. And after the move Rook to b6 by Voltashek, he played Queen e6, which was a clear blunder, and just lost the bishop on f5 due to g4. So a little hard to understand this, and it didn't affect his play afterwards. So what I can say is that Carlson is definitely psychologically extremely strong in bouncing back from bad results. So he could have just played, for example, King h7, but Queen e6 was a bad blunder, and as the game went on, he essentially had almost no compensation for the piece. So let's go on to the next one. Next one was an interesting one, and I did look through games from World Rapid, World Blitz. This is one played by Xray Move with white against Carlson playing black. And in this position, Move played a very nice idea. He ended up playing against the rook on b5 with the plan of queen to d1 and knight b1, knight a3. Quite nice, 2 retreating moves. So remember I was talking about players missing certain moves. This was very likely missed by Carlson. I assume that he played his rook out there and just assumed that, well, it should be safe because I don't see how it can be attacked. So this may very well be a case of him just simply overlooking the retreating move, queen d1, followed by knight to b1. So knight to b1 was played, knight a3, and this was nice as well. Take, rook to c5, and after b4, the rook is trapped anyway. Take, and all the squares are covered. So, so this is the first instance of a move that Carlson may have simply missed. Just this retreating move, queen d1, which is a pretty slow plan to find in a blitz game. So very impressive to Move for finding this. But this is exactly the kind of one mover that can easily determine a match, a game, anything really. So that was an interesting one. All right, let's go on. Okay. So here's another interesting case. This was a game played between Carlson and Nakamura. This was just from chess.com, but it was played last year. It was 5-2 time control. And a typical move here might be something like queen to d3. Just kind of keeping an eye on all the squares here, giving yourself the possibility of recapturing, for example, of capturing the pawn this way. You're covering everything nicely. He played the move knight b takes a4. And the problem here is that after knight to d4, queen h2, now there was b5. So now his queen isn't in a position, his queen was not in a position to actually stop the knight from being trapped. What happened was the knight came up to b6 and then simply got trapped on b6. I'll play a few more moves. Take, and then queen to d8, and the knight was trapped. Knight was not able to get out. So that was an interesting case, and he ended up actually winning the game eventually after many more moves, but this is a lost position right here. Some of these cases you'll notice will be certainly quite curious. This was played over the board in a blitz event between Carlson and Bachar-Lagrave, and here c3 was played, which was just a pure blunder because it allowed b3, and the knight simply was short of squares. So it's really interesting when I look over some of these Carlson games, because you'll notice that some of these moves were played in classical games. Some of these were just not from Rapid or Blitz. This one in particular was, but it's amazing that also Carlson, being number one in the world, in Blitz, was still blundering this way. So it's interesting that somebody over 2,900 in Blitz made this type of error, but they have to make certain types of errors, so it's just really interesting to see which ones they make. So instead of c3, a better move would be queen b5 check, and he could just actually pick off the pawn here on a5. So that would be one way that the play could continue, but c3 was a pretty simple blunder in view of b3. All right, let's go on to the next one. This one caught my eye. I actually didn't even know of its existence until I just was searching through games. This was Kamsky versus Carlson, played in the World Cup. This was kind of an older game, but an interesting case of the rook on g6 getting trapped after knight to f4, rook h6 and g5. And notice how the knights control all the squares and everything else is controlled, so the rook just got trapped. So it definitely seems like Carlson, for a player of his unbelievable strength, certainly had an unusual number of games where pieces were trapped. So that's definitely something to pay attention to, especially if someone's playing rapid against him. So let's go on to another one. This was a really interesting one. This was Aronian versus Carlson, played in Altibox, Norway, 2017. And it's very hard to fault Carlson for taking the pawn after the spectacular move, a3, great move played by Aronian. And, you know, it's a very tricky move. Bishop to d6 is probably the safest move, but bishop takes a3 was played by Carlson. And again, what I think he underestimated, he may have underestimated two details here. One is that his king may potentially come under fire, and the other is that it may be much harder than it appears to actually bring his queen out to safety. As you see, the move c5. So white not only sacrificed a pawn, also sacrificed the exchange, and the whole point was to lock the queen in a box. Because if queen a5, we have knight takes d5, and the queen isn't able to retreat because the knight covers the c7 square. So in this position, it's very hard to figure out a way out. So he tries b6, and he may have missed that after knight to b1, queen to a2, there's this nice move, queen to c1, and now there are moves like knight to c3, and the queen is really in bad shape here. So it may have just been a case of not seeing deeply enough, but it also may have been a little bit careless just in the placing of the pieces. So in this case, white would have had a nearly winning position. So white didn't play it at the absolute best. White played b4, which was a quite enterprising move. And in this case, again, Carlson didn't play the best. He played the move rook to b8, and it appears that he underestimated his king position. Bishop takes h7 check was played in the game, but there's this move queen c2, which gains a key tempo by hitting h7. So after f5, we can play take. Part of the problem here is that, again, the queen is in trouble. And you see the bishop nicely covers squares. We have knight to d4 as a move. We have knight takes e6 as a move. And we also have ideas like bishop c3 and rook to a1 to trap the queen. So this would have been objectively winning for white. So there's a combination of a couple things. The queen position and also the king position. So of course, Carlson definitely deserves to be commended for the bravery in taking the pawn. But as you can see, the queen ended up in very serious trouble. And since Carlson loses so few classical games, the ones that he does actually lose are of extra interest. So let's go on to the next one. Yeah, this was a game that Carlson lost to Ian Nepomniachtchi in the London Classic last year. I'm just going to flip the board so we can look at it from Carlson's side, or from the black side, sorry, the side that won. Carlson played c5. A simpler way to play it would just be to go rook a3, and if they take the c4 pawn, take, we can play rook a8, and it's going to be 4 pawns versus 4 pawns. This will probably be a drawish endgame. For instance, rook c8, take, I'll play rook a8, and we'll have queen and bishop versus queen and bishop and 4 pawns for both sides. So that would have been a quite reasonable way to play. Instead, he plays c5, and I think this was all based on an oversight. So rook takes c5 was played, which this isn't terrible because after take, queen takes a1, king h2, queen takes a5, you could still play c takes b6, and you have 4 versus 3 on one side. You're down a pawn, opposite color bishops, but you have pretty solid chances of actually drawing this. But instead of this, he played the move queen to c6, And this was quite a memorable position because, again, we have to think about undefended pieces. The bishop on f4 is undefended. And notice that the queen is undefended, the rook is undefended, but with one move, queen a4, we defend the rook through Xray, you could say. And we also hit the undefended bishop on a4. So with this one single move, black wins a piece and wins the game. So you could say that, you could argue that this is an Xray type of move that was missed. So that was pretty surprising. It can happen in time trouble, but it's something to note. It's something to at least pay attention to. So let's go on to the next one. This was a pretty surprising one. This is one where Carlson was playing white, and it seemed like he was going to scoop up one of the pawns and win the game. It just seemed quite bad for black, and he ended up just playing a blunder here. He played king to f3, and what happens here is there's the spectacular knight to b5. The point being that here there's this move knight to c3, there's a threat of queening the pawn, and notice if they play king to e3, this was played in the game, oops, there's b2, we can't take it because of knight to d1 check, forking the rook and the king. So this was an unusual case of just kind of carelessness in terms of bringing the king over. The simplest way to play it, just king b1, play rook b4, and now the simple king to e1, and white wins. So I remember watching this game. This was Carlson, Radjabov, Linares 2009. I remember being really shocked by this move because it's one of those cases where there's a tendency to go, well, king f3, king f1, it shouldn't make a big difference. But in this case, king f1 just wins, and king f3 allows the draw. So a bit of carelessness with the king position. And I'm going to show you a parallel example here. Parallel example of being careless with the king position. Actually, what's funny is it's careless about the king position allowing knight forks. And you'll see the exact same example kind of here. In this example, Carlson Anand played in the World Championship in 2014. Carlson played king to d2, which was quite a bad blunder because it allowed knight takes e5. a4 was played, which was a blunder. Knight takes e5, hitting the undefended rook here. And the point was, after takes, there's knight takes c4 check, and after king to d3, there's knight to b2 check, an intermediate check, saving the knight. So it's interesting that these are, in a weird way, parallel mistakes. So that's definitely something to pay attention to, especially in any kind of time trouble, late in the game. Easy to miss, but important to pay attention to. All right, let's go on to the next one. I also want to say that that at the level that Carlson plays, it's quite unlikely that he would be making major opening mistakes. I mean, simply put, if he's analyzing with a strong team, it's very, very likely that they've analyzed everything out to draws or equality with supercomputers. So really what practical opening preparation would look like would be mostly looking for vulnerabilities and surprises, positions that are approximately equal but more pleasant for your side. Those types of things kind of represent the future of opening preparation, and at least at the highest level. And I could definitely see that that Carlson did an interesting job in this current World Championship match of selecting positions that he could play for a win. So let's take a look at the... Wait, did I look at that one? So in this one... Oh, sorry, I need to go back. Let's go back one. Let me open that one up. Bu Zhangzi, Carlson. Yeah, this was mostly a memorable game because Carlson missed a move, and I'm referring to missing moves here. And he played rook to e. He played, I think he played, what did he play? Bishop takes and rook to e3, right? Yeah, he played bishop takes d5 and then rook to e3. And what ended up happening is he allowed g5, and here his king was in horrible shape. So the problem here is that he just had a horrible king position. And what would have been much stronger was to play the move rook to e2, which is a difficult sort of sliding move. So his mistake was that he seemingly may have just missed this idea of blocking his king, and if queen to g4 check, he can also block with rook to g2 rook to g2 because his bishop defends his queen. And these types of sliding moves, especially in defense, can be very difficult to play. So this is a certain type of move to pay close attention to. And notice that he was defending here after a piece sacrifice. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, here was another interesting case. This was Carlson versus Audubon, played in Tata Steel 2017. Actually, let me go to the other board here. Oops. Go to the other board here. Go here. All right. So in this position, black can black played knight d5, bishop d2. And now, after queen g4, rook e1, black actually has a spectacular move, and it's of in the same vein as the previous move, rook to e2. And this move is rook to e3, a spectacular sliding move. And it's a sliding move because the two pieces are in contact, but rather than capturing the piece, I just slide along the line right to e3. Very unexpected because we have a tendency to calculate forcing lines. And here, rather than playing the direct capture, we simply slide along the line here. And if f takes e3, the point is take, take, and d takes e3, and now there's this very strong threat of taking, and this is winning for black. So, for instance, here we can take these pawns, play the check, and to pick off the rook, and then we have a winning position by queening. So, after rook to e3, and by the way, if you don't take it after rook to e3, like queen to f1, we can simply play rook to f3, and now we can play knight to e3, another brutal move. So this would have been very, very strong. And to all appearances, Carlson just missed the move rook to e3, which is a difficult move, but at the same time, it's important to be aware of which types of moves he's missing. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, so here's another example of a difficult move missed by Carlson. And by the way, I'm not saying any of these moves are easy moves. They're the types of moves that when you deeply analyze your games, you'll notice them, and oftentimes you'll think to yourself, oh, well, I can definitely see myself playing that in the future. In this position, Carlson played queen h5, but a much stronger move is the simple queen to e1, playing bishop to e2. And what he can do here is if take, take, he can play queen to d1, nicely controlling this diagonal and also controlling the d file. So queen to e1 is a very nice retreating move. Again, we talked about retreating moves before. And so in this case, for instance, if queen c5, we play bishop e2, take, take, and we get to go queen d1. So here we have our ideal setup with white, and white has a spectacular position. So this was definitely something that is easy to miss, and Carlson did not find it. He's had some difficulties against Bu Jiangzi. So one of the earlier games was against Bu Jiangzi. This one was also against Bu Jiangzi from the World Rapid Championship. Let's go on to the next one. All right, so here's another example of a difficult move. This is an example of an Xray move, and by Xray I mean that we are required to see through pieces to see a tactic. And what I mean by this is after the move knight to f3, a very impressive move. This was not played by Carlson. He played the move, what did he play? Bishop h3. He played bishop h3, and then knight c2 check was played. And then in this position, he was slightly worse. Black had 3 pawns for the piece, a protected pass pawn on e4, and it was a difficult defense from here. But after knight f3, a very impressive move. Take a look at what happens. Take, take. So we've sacrificed a piece for only 1 pawn, but look what's happened. Now we're attacking the knight. Now our bishop is attacking the rook, and our rook on e1 is hitting e7 through Xray. You might wonder, well, what do you mean by through Xray? Well, take a look. Knight c2 check. Take, 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 take. And now we have rook takes e7. Our rook, which seemed dormant with the pawn on e4, now is able to capture the e7 pawn. So it's mostly about considering the move knight f3 in the first place. That's the hard part. So that is definitely something to pay attention to. This type of move is a difficult move, but at that elite level, it's definitely within consideration. So let's go on to the next one. Yeah, and here's another fun example. This was Joe Bava Carlson. This is an older game, but what's really interesting about it, Rook F1, Queen to D6, Bishop E4, Bishop E3. What's really amazing about it is that there's a similar idea. There's an Xray against the B7 pawn to hit the Rook, and there's also a knight move that hits the Queen. And after knight to B5, which is an unbelievable move, take, Bishop to C6 check. As you can see, the Queen is stuck defending the F8 bishop, and if they take, then we simply take here. So in the game, he ended up losing, and there was a very nice sequence here. Joe Bava was able to win back the piece, and then he was able to put his rook in a good position where there weren't any checks to his king. Rook F4, very nice move, and he was able to play Queen C5, and A takes B5, and that was the end of the game. So this was a really well played game by Joe Bava, but the initial point was the Xray move, knight to B5, and the target on B7. So really impressive game by Joe Bava here, but definitely something to notice that was missed. So let's go on. Yeah, here was a game where I was helping the player, well, let's say helping prepare the player who was playing white in this game. Very strong player, Tommy Newback. It's a friend of mine who I had a lot of fun analyzing with. And yeah, one of the great things about preparing against players like Svidler, Kramnik, Carlson is, you never know kind of what exactly they're going to play into. And usually my only help I could offer in that case was to try to offer something kind of tricky and unexpected that was just sort of outside of something they had been analyzing recently. And in some cases I had some of those recommendations, and I was glad that I was able to at least play some helping role. So in this case, Tommy Newback played a great move against Carlson and probably was just simply underestimated. He played the move after Queen C7, he played the move A4. And what this did was it sacrificed a full piece. He sacrifices his knight on C3 and goes knight takes C6. You might wonder, well, what is he doing here? Well, he sacrificed a piece for two connected passed pawns, and they definitely have the potential to roll. So he plays takes and Rook A1. And now, after Rook E8, knight E5, yeah, so basically Carlson tried to sacrifice a piece back with knight takes C5, except it didn't work because there was B6. And after Queen to B5, take, there was a very nice finish here. Check. G3. And unfortunately for Carlson here, he's not able to actually get any serious threats. So after Queen F5, there's simply Queen B2, and you'll see the king is actually completely safe here. Pawn's advancing, king is safe, and not much to do. Take. Newback gets his second queen, and was able to win from here. Carlson resigned. So a pretty amazing case of a positional piece sacrifice, which likely was completely underestimated or maybe missed entirely. So let's go on to the next one. Yeah, the next one was a case of, it seemed like it was a case of Carlson, again, missing a piece sacrifice, and you'll see what I mean. Queen to C2, Rook C1, Queen to D2. Okay, so Anand played this beautiful move, bishop to G5. It's a great move. Point being, if F6, there's knight takes E5. Here you can see that there are two different tactical problems here. There's this issue with the king, or there's the issue with the undefended bishop on E7. So Bishop G5 was a great move by Anand. And after takes, Rook C8, Rook F1 was a great move. And I assume that this knight E6 move was just completely missed. So fantastic piece sacrifice, and basically what he's doing here is he's just attacking with his three remaining pieces and bringing the queen in to capture this pawn, and then the G6 pawn is weak as well. And it seems like Carlson's issue here was just underestimation of king position. So now F4 came. And yeah, it's very, very hard to defend. I'll just show a short line. If he takes, if takes bishop c6, there's queen takes, and then there's a threat of just going e7 check, and the king has no moves. So so yeah, this knight e6 move was probably just missed. f4 and f5, and yeah, this was one of the most crushing games that Anand played. So he brought his rook up, a nice rook lift. He played this whole sequence very impressively. Take, e7. e7 threatens bishop check, and queen takes h6. So bishop h5, queen takes d6. All right, and then Carlson resigned. Let's see. Yeah, and then here we're getting into the cases where Carlson simply overpressed. And here black has a nice solid position. He could play rook to b8. The position's probably equal. They trade off rooks. He tried d3, and look what happens after e3. The problem is Rapport played bishop to g2, and this was Rapport Carlson Tata Steel 2017. And what ends up happening is that white's pawns are able to march up the board, are able to march up here with f4 and e45. So after rook c8, he played f4, and then e4. And what ends up happening here is there's no good way to stop e5. And notice that this only occurred because d3 was played. And I get it, Carlson wanted to play for a win, but unfortunately, this didn't work. So when this was played, oh yeah, he even sacrificed the queen for a rook. Knight to f1, and then Carlson resigned here. So really impressive play by Rapport after the blunder, but this was a case of simply losing a game that didn't need to be lost. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, this is a game, you've probably seen it online somewhere. This was Sarich Carlson, and Carlson sacrificed 2 pawns in the opening, which was very risky, and Sarich actually defended here very, very confidently. This was played in the Tromsø Olympiad in 2014. And basically what he did was he played knight c3 and f4. This was really impressive because now his queen has a safe square to go to on g3, after which he can simply develop his pieces. And again, he's up 2 pawns. So this appears to be a case of simply overpressing on Carlson's part, or perhaps basically thinking he could get away with it against a lower rated player, which is essentially the same thing, you know, not taking somebody seriously enough. So queen g3 played, take, b3, and he played d3, and g6, bishop b2, and this was a very nice move played by Sarich right here, bishop e5. It's a beautiful move. And after queen to d8, queen takes h6, rook takes e5. So it looks like there's going to be bishop g5 coming up, trapping the queen. Nope, there comes d6. d6 is a fantastic move, and it opens up the bishop, and it allows white to take and then go after the f7 pawn. So after rook to e2, point being if bishop f8, take, there's queen check, and then pawn takes. And the black king is in a terrible position here. So instead of that, rook to e2 was played, take, and then f5. And this was the game continuation. And after queen to f4, take, white was up a number of pawns. How many pawns is he up here? 2, 4, 6, 7, 2, 4. Okay, he's up 2 pawns against the world champion, and converted it very nicely, in fact. Yeah, he still remains 2 pawns up. And then now rook to e8 check, and Carlson resigned in view of takes, check, and then he's getting a new queen. So that unfortunately didn't work out for him. Here's another case of overpressing. This was Pantsulaya Carlsen from the World Rapid Championship. And in this case, Carlsen played queen to f7. I mean, there were a number of reasonable looking solid moves. But queen f7 was a bad move, allowing for bishop h3. I mean, he basically put all his eggs in one basket to play f3, and then f3 was played and nothing happened. There was no continuation. And so after take c5, he had a losing position. Basically, he put everything into playing f3, and then it didn't do anything. It actually allowed white to activate his bishop, and wasn't helpful there. Here's a game probably a lot of people aren't that aware of. Hu Yifan Carlson, Grenke Classic 2018. And this was probably the only example I have of Carlson being positionally outplayed, and he didn't need to be. I mean, he could just play queen c7, nice solid move. He plays b5, and take a look at what happens here. He goes rook c6, and then there's knight to d2, and now the knight's coming over to a nice square. Knight to c4, and queen to a7. So this was the actual game continuation, and amazing thing is, you know, I wanted to make sure I checked this with the computer, and it says +2. The domination that white has, I mean, this is spectacular positional domination. The knight on b7 is horribly passive, just a very bad position for black. I mean, the computer just gives the simple plan of h4, h5. This is the engine plan, says +2. And I definitely agree, it's pure domination. Black is basically helpless here. So this was a case of Hu Yifan outplaying Carlson. And I get it, Carlson clearly wanted to play for a win, but basically after simply taking and going rook d5 and knight d2, knight c4, black got a very bad position. So Carlson, you know, really shouldn't have pressed in this way, at least. All right, this is a recent game. This was played just before the World Championship, Carlsen-Donchenko European Club Cup, and this was an odd case because this is a case where it appears like he misevaluated his king position, because he could play rook e4. That's what I think everybody was expecting. And then if takes, there's rook hf4. So here he's attacking. And after something like knight c4, the point is, of course, you know, they can't take because he'll simply take. And if something like bishop c7, he can just go d6. So in this case, it looks like white just has a winning or very, very close to winning position. It's a pretty dominant position here. So this was quite a curious case. A little hard to explain. In the game, he played rook f4, and after queen h3, there's the threat of the rook, and there's also the threat of mate in 1, so white has to give back the exchange, or give up the exchange, I should say. And Carlson had to give up a draw to a player 229 points lower rated. All right, let's go on to the next one. Yeah, here's a game Caruana Carlson played in the World Championship. And he played g5. I mean, the interesting thing is he plays g5 to play f4, but the move f4 could have actually just been played right away, f4 supported with bishop g5. So that would have been the right way to do it. And in this case, black is doing totally fine, but take a look at what happens. After g5 in the game, he played bishop c4 and bishop c3, a fantastic plan. And in this resulting position here, white had a very, very nice attack. And actually, you know, computers give rook a d1 +2, rook a e1 +3, the stunning move g4 +5 when left on overnight at depth 55 or something on Stockfish. So in this position, I mean, part of the problem here is that there's just this big open space, and there's no way to actually protect black's king in the long run. You know, for instance, after rook a to d1, after rook a to d1 with the queen on h5, there are big problems with the holes in this direction against black's king. So this was definitely an underestimation of the weaknesses of his king position. He may have underestimated bishop d2, bishop c3, but all the same, it's underestimation of king position. So that's definitely something that Caruana was able to exploit. So if his team specifically noticed that, then kudos to them. That's a very impressive realization. All right, let's go on to the next one. Here's an interesting one a lot of people wouldn't have seen. It's Carlson Ganguly, played in the Qatar World Rapid Championship, and Carlson played the move king to e1, which wasn't a good move. I mean, essentially, I was thinking of a plan like bishop to b2, and one of the plans he could play is he does have the idea of either f3 or f4, and he can move the king away. But what he does is he pins himself, and this isn't good. And he goes queen g6, so essentially he puts all his eggs in one basket going for this attack, and what ends up happening is that now he's in a very passive spot, and after b3, he has these issues with his king. So Carlson ended up playing knight takes b3, and actually had a totally losing position. And this was all based on king position, all based on bad king position with white. So that's definitely another important thing to notice. And this is why we look through all the games, not just classical games. It's That's why we look through rapid games as well. You never know when you'll be playing somebody in rapid. Here's one, Carlson Anand, Chorus Washikan Z 2008. And this was a case where Carlson misevaluated the king position. He played bishop to f3. He should have played knight to g3. And the point is, after knight to g3, take, here black's king position is extremely weak in view of the f7 pawn being an extremely difficult to defend focal point. And white would only have to sacrifice the exchange in order to get this with knight to g3. In the game, you'll see what happened. He plays bishop f3, take, and he tries to sacrifice with bishop takes h5, although his opponent captures the other way, which was a brilliant move. And Carlson sacrifices the piece, and in this position, Carlson played queen h7 check, and then the black king just simply ran away. And amazingly, the king is just nice and safe here on d6. So Carlson wasn't able to get anything going. So he may have just misevaluated the king position for his opponent and also for himself. Let's go on to the next one. All right, so I think this is the last one I have here, but in this case, this was a case that 1IM brought up to me. Basically, Carlson was pressing against Vichigov in the Grenke Classic 2018, and he played king f1, which was rather slow. He should have played rook to a5, g3, f4, kind of classical Magnus. Basically, you can bring your king up, and if they ever take, you take back, and now you have a pawn that can advance. And notice the black rook can't really move, so white has a lot of room to play here. But instead, you'll see what happened in the game. He had a nice chance to press with rook a5 and then g3, f4. He played king f1, which seemed to be rather lazy. So I don't know, I guess he thought he could just keep playing as long as he wanted, but wasn't able to turn it into anything. And what you'll notice is that the last example I have here is from Caruana Carlson, game 12. And in this case, he also was not able to press how he should have. In this position, actually, he has a nice, straightforward plan of take, b5. This works out perfectly. Taking opens up this diagonal, and by playing b5, of course, they cannot take, because then he takes on d3, and there's the mate on c2. So this line, I was looking at it and thinking, is there any defense here? And the computer just gives a score of like -3. So apparently there is no way to defend after this. So this would have been a spectacular way for Carlson to continue. But he said himself that he just doesn't quite have the same energy to press some games, which is interesting. So it'll be very interesting to see what goes on from here. But as you can see, certain types of mistakes Carlson made. He had some issues with trap pieces. He had some issues with undefended pieces. He was missing certain types of moves, some Xray moves, some retreating moves, some sliding moves. Certain piece sacrifices surprised him. He overpressed in some games. He had certainly some underestimation of his own king position in some of the games, and he didn't quite have the energy that he had a few years ago. So it'll be very interesting to see how it goes from here.